So it's an honor for me to introduce to you Professor Hulisani Ramatswana, who is the first one to give us a presentation. And my co-moderator is going to introduce the second presenter when their time comes. Okay, so Professor Hulisani Ramatswana is a professor of Old Testament at the University of South Africa, where he also serves as the head of the Department of Biblical and Ancient Studies. His research interest encompasses a wide range of areas with a particular focus on decolonialization, imperial dynamics, decolonial interpretations, the Hebrew Bible, and biblical theology. His work also focuses on African biblical hermeneutics, which explores the use of African knowledge systems as essential tools for interpreting biblical text. Additionally, he is dedicated to the decolonization of translated Bibles, aiming to restore the integrity of indigenous languages and cultures. He serves as the chief editor of the journal Old Testament Essays and is also involved in the Biblical Review Project with the Bible Society of South Africa. Furthermore, he also serves as pastor at the Light Reformed Community Church in Pretoria, Sunnyside, South Africa. And his presentation, the title is Colonial Dynamics and the Impoverishment of Africa 140 years after the Berlin Conference. So over to you, Professor.
Good afternoon. It is a pleasure for me to be here and to have this opportunity to make this presentation. As an African, how do I genuinely reflect on the Berlin Conference of 1884-1885 in light of Africa's current stuck and complex situation? After 140 years after the Berlin Conference or the Congo Conference, no African country is classified among the developed countries of the world except for the Seychelles, which is an island nation with a population of just 132,000 people. The issue of poverty is particularly acute in Africa, with 438.6 million people living in extreme poverty. This is not just numbers. It represents the daily struggles of individuals and families who face a lack of basic necessities such as food, clean water, electricity, housing, sanitation, and healthcare, among other things. In the Congo Basin, especially the Democratic Republic of Congo, once a focal point of colonial ambitions, approximately 73.5% of the population finds itself entrenched in extreme poverty. Jeffrey Sachs' prophetic proclamation in his book, The End of Poverty, which was published in 2005, that poverty could end by 2025, has unfortunately not come true. Moreover, the continent continues to grapple with conflicts and wars. Nations like Sudan, South Sudan, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Ethiopia, Libya are embroiled in turmoil, contributing to widespread suffering and displacement. The recurring pattern of coup d'etats in the Sahel region illustrates a concerning trend of political instability. The African continent is a paradox, a place rich in cultures, history, and natural resources, and yet and trapped and burdened by the systematic challenges that drive individuals to seek escape. Many risk their lives crossing the Mediterranean Sea, hoping to discover a better future elsewhere, away from the trials they face in Africa. This is not to say that there are no positive stories that are emerging from Africa. They are there, and they are many. Indeed, but the reality remains. Africa is underdeveloped. In the terms of decolonial scholars, we remain trapped under the colonial matrix of power, which encompasses basically the structures and patterns which were set up by the colonial machinery. The Berlin Conference, 1884, 1885, in my view, was a reinforcement of the colonial machinery. The question may be asked, is there any significance for us to reflect on the legacy of the Berlin Conference 140 years later? As others will claim, let bygones be bygones, focus on the present and the future. I guess it is hard to forget when the Democratic Republic of Congo is in a state of turmoil. Or as others will say, we have had enough of the emotional blackmail by Africans blaming the Europeans or the West for their own failures in the present. I guess it is simple for others to say when the scars and the lingering pains should go away. Or as others will say, stop whining. Anyway, pre-colonial Africa did not have the economic and political institutions to facilitate growth and development. I guess for those, one can simply say, who is to judge what we could have done when we had a chance to develop in our own terms? Or as others will say, be thankful for the civilization that colonialism brought to Africa. Do we have a reason to be thankful? The Berlin Conference was not the beginning of colonialism. It was a reinforcement of the colonial machinery. That conference focused on Africa, her people, and her resources for the use of European nations. This was a conference about Africa without Africans for the benefit of Europeans. Thus, when we deal with the impoverishment of Africa, as Walter Rodney argued years ago in his book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa, the question is who and what is responsible for the impoverishment of Africa? The answer that he gives in that book is clear. It is in the title. It is the European imperialists or colonialists who are responsible. While that is true, it does not mean that as Africans we do not critically look at ourselves, yet our critical assessment of the self does not absolve the other. The fact remains that Africa would not have been impoverished the way that it has been if it were not for colonialism and the reinforcement by the Berlin Conference. Prior to this conference, the explorers, capitalists, and settlers who laid claim to Africa and to African territories exploited the continent. It was for economic reasons that they came, and they had short-term and long-term goals. In these explorations of theirs and in these takeovers of the land, they had the blessing and the justification of the church. It was in the name of God that explorers and settlers armed with the doctrine of discovery will immediately and automatically grant themselves property, political power, and commercial rights over the newly discovered world and their inhabitants. In my context, the South African context, the takeover of the land was violent, and it eventually resulted in 93% of the land owned by the minority white, whereas the majority, the indigenous people, only owned 7% of the land in 1910, by 1910. This was slightly revised afterwards to 13% of land ownership. And today, when a bill is introduced or an act is there about expropriation of land with nil compensation, issues are raised. The other thing is the enslavement of African people, which was ongoing even before the Berlin Conference. Now, it took two forms: slave trade and also enslavement in the land. Now, the colonial machinery has a way of adapting to changes. At first, it was the slave trade, trading in human beings. Over 20 million Africans shipped from the continent, underdeveloping Africa. When that seemed not to serve them anymore, the strategy had to change. We don't have to trade in human beings anymore. And that's what the Berlin Act of 1885 deals with. Let's not trade in human beings. Let's enslave them in the land. This machinery in the Congo Basin, it internationalized the space. It was free for all the colonizing nations to trade there, which implied that no one will be charged taxes or levies on the activities that they will be doing in that area. Even if the taxes were paid and the levies were made, it was not going to be for the benefit of the African people. The conference reinforced the principle of effective occupation, effective colonization. And therefore it meant direct rule had to be enforced. And here are some of the implications of the direct rule. First, it entailed political control over territories, and such control superseded any structure which was there. This meant our people, all of a sudden, found themselves having to be judged by laws not their own, overridden by laws not their own. Second, it implied that the colonizing state controlled the raw materials. They were no longer in control. Third, it implied a hierarchical and paternalistic relations that are now established. The colonizers had powers over the indigenous people. Their preservation, care, moral, and material well-being. What it basically implied that they had the power to colonize their minds. Fourth, this conference accelerated the partitioning of Africa. The partitioning was already happening. It was simply the reinforcement of the partitioning. And this is the legacy that I live with. Africa remains partitioned along colonial lines. Or as Adebayo frames it, we live with the curse of Berlin as it legitimized the scramble of Africa. The Berlin Conference aimed to avoid conflicts amongst the colonizing nations, not conflicts amongst us. The resources exploited from Africa through colonialism have not served the African people. It's still, and we find ourselves impoverished. We live with colonial identities as westernized Africans. I am a South African. I don't know what that means, because I have an identity. I am Muvenda. I'm not a South African. It is a colonial identity that I live with. Colonialism, direct form of colonialism is over, but yet coloniality remains. The structures, the patterns remains, which keeps us entrapped. As decolonial scholars will say, and I am trying here to paraphrase Maldonado Torres, and I will say it is maintained, the colonial structures are maintained in AI tools, in platforms of learning, in cultural patterns, in the self-image of oneself, and in our own aspirations. In a way, as Maldonado Torres states, as modern subjects, we breathe coloniality all the time and every day. The structures of the colonial powers remain intact. I should say, I am going to simply highlight three which keeps us entrapped. Number one is what we call sanctions. Sanctions is the control of trade. Now, the Berlin Conference was about trade, trading in Africa, and the control of trade still remains with them. When sanctions are imposed on the third world countries or the underdeveloped countries, it means that those nations are greatly affected by such sanctions. The partners are reduced, trading partners. The GDP of those countries declines, which impacts the socio-economic factors of the country. There are several countries in Africa which are under sanctions as we speak: Zimbabwe, Somalia, Sudan, South Sudan, the CAR, DRC, Libya, Niger, amongst others. Zimbabwe, which is our neighbors, for many years now has been under sanctions following its accelerated land reform program of the early 2000s. The sanctions have resulted in the decline of the Zimbabwean economy, leading to the brain drain in Zimbabwe. As people seek greener pastures in other countries. The other form of control is overthrow of governments. To overthrow governments in Africa, the former colonial powers use their international instruments to create a narrative to justify their invasion and overthrow of foreign governments. Such interventions tend to send those countries on a downward spiral. The case of Libya is the one that we can point to. Outside of Africa, the case of Iraq is another one that we can point to. What happened to Libya can also happen to South Africa. The narrative has been generated. South Africa is committing genocide against Afrikaners, and therefore necessitating the USA to give them a free passage to the United States. And there are Afrikaners who have already departed, and they are in their new home in the USA. What it simply means is that South Africa, if the Afrikaners had responded, and that's my reading of the narrative, if they had responded in large numbers and vacated the land, the next logical thing to do was to overthrow government. That is my simple reading of the situation. The narrative does not have to make sense. The world can say whatever it says, but who can stop them if they are about to overthrow your government? The other thing is monopoly of military powers. The nations which wield military power have the ability to control things at the global stage. The 5 countries that have veto powers, who can touch them? Who can do anything to them? A weak Africa serves them. In actual fact, it is their military base of these countries. They have bases in Africa. An Africa that cannot protect its own territory remains open to exploitation. Former colonial powers continue to exert influence through military and security arrangements, often framed as partnerships of stability. These arrangements can entrench dependency and limit the autonomy of African states. Unfortunately, for as long as Africa remains weak militarily, it cannot deliver its people from the impoverishment that others have caused. An Africa that is always at war with itself cannot be a safe haven for its own people. Of course, we cannot simply point fingers to others. We also point fingers at ourselves. Corruption is also impoverishing Africa. The current impoverishment of Africa has to do with the failures within, the failures of our leaders. The Chinese have the proverb which says a fish rots from the head, meaning that corruption usually starts with those in leadership and it spreads. In my own language, we have a proverb that is similar, which says, Tobere atudza na baranda batudza. Basically, it means if the king starts limping, the subjects also start limping because they see their leader limping. Now, the limping which we see in Africa starts with the leaders. What is impoverishing Africa? It is the neo-patrimonialism, that is a political system characterized by connections between leaders and the people or patrons or clients. Such a political system, as some scholars argue, is marred by poor governance due to the following, amongst others. First, the failure to implement even policies that you have in place. Second, it is the patrimonial politics, a system in which politicians and the bureaucrats find a way to channel state resources towards their own self-enrichment rather than the improvement of the nation. The politics of favor. The reasoning here is that the political culture in Africa is characterized by scratch my back and I scratch yours. This is the mentality which is there amongst our politicians and our people in the exchange of gifts. And of course, failure to hold people accountable. When individuals and leaders are not held accountable, they impoverish the nation, and they go unpunished. In my context, my South African context, projects in some instances have to be done, not once, not twice, but a number of times. And all those times, money is sniffled out of the state coffers, impoverishing our people. The call for Africa solutions to African problems, it's a worthy call. But is it yielding results? Corruption is subtle and undermines the systems and institutions that are there to hold people accountable, resulting in the enrichment and protection of the few. Moving forward, what do we do? The Berlin Conference was promulgated in the name of God, the Almighty. Is our response going to be just us speaking? Or do we have to invoke the name of God Almighty in our response? As we invoke the name of God Almighty, do we approach it in an African way of reversing the curse? Now, in our culture, some of us, when you are bewitched, you also consult and you send back whatever was brought to you. It goes back to the sender. They receive it. Is that the approach? That is an approach of hatred, which will not help us address and build as we move forward as Africans. In my view, what we need is decolonial justice at this point. A justice which requires us as Africans to unite. A divided Africa is a weak Africa. We will continue to be weak if we continue simply with the structures that have been set up for us. Second, decolonizing of knowledge, reclaiming our own wisdom and educational systems. I have been trained in Western forms of knowledge and paradigms. I'm a westernized being, and part of the thing that I have to do on myself is to unlearn the things that I have been taught in order to relearn what was lost. Of course, we also need government reform, building transparent and accountable governments is what we need in our context. And that is agent, and the holding of people accountable cannot be delayed any longer. And yes, we need equitable partnerships, which implies that we have to renegotiate at an international level and not stick with the partnerships that continue to impoverish Africa. In the name of God, my hope is that we will overcome. Thank you.
Thank you very much. You've actually spoken less than the 30 minutes that was assigned to you. We were talking about, okay, do I now send you a message to say that you have 5 minutes more? But I thank you so much for your inspiring presentation. You have helped us, to walk with you from asking the question, what is impoverishing Africa, looking at before Berlin, during the Berlin period, and during our own leadership. And so where are we when it comes to answering this question? And I'm hoping that, when it's time for conversation, you help us. We'll hear from people, and then you also guide us after you have received, the response from others. But it was a very powerful presentation. So let's give him another clap.